Hi, I'm Julia Adolphe, and welcome to LooseLeaf Notebook. Today I am joined by composer Christopher Trapani. Christopher has received many prestigious awards and commissions, including the Rome Prize, Guggenheim Fellowship, Gaudimus Award, Frome Commission, and Barlow Prize. Chris shares his experience with clinical depression and how it impacts his creative process, how he filters his memories, and his communication in his music and in life. Hi, Christopher. How are you?
Hi, Julia. I'm all right. Thanks for inviting me to do this.
So, I read your really beautiful and honestly quite poetic article, Clouds on Clouds, in New Music Box. So, I was just curious what kind of prompted you to share this information now, to kind of talk publicly about having experienced depression?
The impetus for the article was really this desire to explain something about my own work that I didn't think was quite getting across. I felt like I needed to say, here's why I use these gray, noisy sounds in my music. Here's what they mean to me. I mean, I'm one of those composers who believes that maybe the meat of the work of composing is expressing something very personal, and this was maybe the most personal thing
Yeah.
that I could express, because as I say in the article, I think that half of the time what I'm doing is evading
Right.
depression and using composing as kind of an escape mechanism, and writing these deliberately colorful, busy, boisterous pieces. And then I found that those were the pieces that people were latching onto and associating with me.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to try to shift the perception a little bit. I'm thinking about one piece in particular
Mm-hmm.
that started this, and it's a piece called Rust and Stardust. I was lucky enough in 2015 to have two premieres sort of back to back, one in France, which was a piece called Spinning in Infinity, which is just very colorful. And then I wrote the sort of opposite piece, Rust and Stardust, which was done in Glasgow. And one of the reviewers called it dreary, accomplished and dreary. That's a quote that I won't forget. And I thought, yes, well, that is kind of what I'm getting at,
Right.
but it shouldn't be the point at which you stop listening.
Mm-hmm.
It should be a gateway into understanding something deeper about the piece and what it's expressing.
I mean, you mentioned that you are often evading the
Mm-hmm.
overwhelm of the depression with colorful music. I don't know if you've noticed that I have a lot of colorful photos on my wall. And I know for me, when I'm feeling incredibly anxious, when I have an anxiety disorder, and when I'm feeling very anxious, sometimes it really helps me to focus on an
Mm-hmm.
image, and it kind of helps me get out of my head a little bit. Can you talk a little bit about how you kind of navigate your different mental states while you're writing?
Sure. Well, let me say first that last year I went to an art exhibit by an artist in Austin, Texas, Allison Noakes, and she spoke in her exhibit about how she struggles with anxiety herself. And so she makes these deliberately colorful, evocative paintings as a means of coping with anxiety. And I found that really striking because that was the first time that something that I had been doing my whole life was kind of articulated. And yeah, there is pretty much always some kind of extra musical angle, a poem or a place or an image that I'm evoking. And I should say that it's not just a strategy in my music, but kind of in the way that I live too. When it used to be possible to travel, I would move around, I would seize on opportunities for evasion and distraction to keep my mind busy and misdirected.
So, at what point does that become a challenge?
I don't really have the answer to how I manage to compose and be depressed.
Yeah.
Other than that, it's really difficult and it's like pulling teeth, but somehow I have generally managed to keep up with deadlines and not abandon big projects. But when I step back, yeah, sometimes it's kind of a mystery to me how I
Mm-hmm.
managed to do that. And I will say that I can go stretches of 9 months or a year without writing anything. And I think that that's necessary for me. There can be spurts when I get 4 or 5 pieces done in a year, and then there can be long dry spells.
Well, you mentioned in your article that you've been writing as long as you've been clinically depressed. So I'm curious what age you're saying that started.
I started writing music a little younger. I started writing music when I was 13 or 14.
Mm-hmm.
But my first breakdown and my first diagnosis came when I was 20.
Mm-hmm. Which is standard.
Which is the average age
Yeah.
of onset. I later learned. I
Yeah.
didn't know that, and that was a bit of a shock and a moment of recalibration in my life.
Mm-hmm.
But it didn't all happen at once. It took me years to sort of get on a more stable regimen.
Does that mean you have in your memory a time of writing and creating that was separate from these feelings of depression?
I could say that.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is what my piece, Sparrow Episodes, is about. It's about the memory of being 16 years old and everything feeling invigorated with life and action and possibility sort of overflowing. And even when I was writing that piece, I was 26 when I wrote it, so I was writing it from a distance. But yeah, it was written to evoke a sensation that I remembered fondly as this pre-depression spark, a time in my life when I didn't really know that kind of gloom yet.
So do you use the different imageries and poems and your, maybe photographs of travel to help reconnect with that time or that mind state?
Oh, sure. Yeah. The same way I think everybody does, looking at old pictures and reading familiar poems, listening to familiar music. It still works, can still transport me back to that time. One of the insidious effects of depression, though, is that it really interferes with the encoding of new experiences.
Okay.
And the development of new memories and the intensity of emotional experience. I think, people who have experienced depression know this on a daily basis. Like things seem distant and gray. But what's not immediately obvious is the sort of cumulative effect.
Mm.
Like looking back on years of your life and noticing that like you basically didn't form any strong memories or attachments, or there's nothing that's vivid and tangible
Mm-hmm.
from entire gaps in my own history.
So there really is, in terms of color, this kind of dichotomy between these sort of bright, vivid memories and kind of like a haze.
That's the way that I've always experienced it. That's a pretty spot on analogy to the way that things are filtered through my own mind.
And is this the first time you've talked about it in a public sense in that article?
It might be the first time that I've spoken about it publicly in a very direct way. Although I don't think for most people who knew me that it was any kind of surprise.
Did you feel when you first learned that you had clinical depression, did you think about sort of the famous melancholic artists, and what are your thoughts about that and kind of how we immortalized some of those people?
That's a great question, and that's a key question. I think for a while it made me kind of suspicious of my own experience. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, am I just trying to be more of an artist by being depressed? Am I just trying to find my own place in the pantheon by giving into those depressive emotions? That took a long time to sort out. Yeah, for instance, like Schumann is a composer that speaks to me and has always spoken to me. And I get that immediate sensation that there is a dark and deep personal experience encoded in the music. Mahler, to a lesser degree, for me. And then I don't want to go down the whole list.
There's a long list.
There's a long list for sure.
So you were saying, you were suspicious of what that meant for you?
It sort of makes you ask yourself, am I trying too hard to throw myself into an artistic mindset, which is the mindset that I have heard that, you know, the great romantic artists let themselves fall into. But after a while, it was pretty clear that these things were sort of independent and out of my control.
So you had to sort of understand that there was a separation between your creative experience and your mental health.
Yeah, exactly. I have always tried to kind of compartmentalize the two.
Yeah.
So that, and I think it's a survival strategy. When I talk about evading when I write music, it's not something that I had an idea like, oh, this will be great for my music. It was the only thing I could do in order to keep writing when I was extremely depressed. It was to write about something else and redirect my attention. And then I've also had to do the opposite, like make a decision to write a piece about an experience that deals with depression fairly directly at a point when I'm not experiencing it as intensely myself, and still having to channel back to those emotions to draw on that experience.
What enables you to make that decision that it's, now is a time to write a piece that looks more directly at my experience with depression?
That's a good question. I don't know if there's a specific time that these ideas are triggered for me. I don't know how you do it, how you keep track of, your ideas for various pieces, but I have sketchbooks and little notebooks where I put things down. And yeah, sometimes I know that there's a particular emotional current that I want to write about. Waterlines is probably a good example. It's a piece I wrote about Hurricane Katrina. There was no getting around the very intense associations for me since it hit my hometown. In a way, you can listen to Waterlines as going through various stages of dealing with the news, I think.
Mm-hmm.
The first movement is supposed to encapsulate this kind of shock and distance and just kind of the weirdness of the whole thing, which you could kind of say for the third movement as well. The second movement is a retelling of everything that happened in a cartoonish intensity. And then the fourth movement is anger and is kind of rage. And the last one is this weird, distanced resignation and starting to hear things just go around in a spiral and feeling, sort of helpless at what's happening. So these are all emotions that hit me at some point while dealing with the aftermath of the hurricane. Yeah, I was able to sort of separate them out. I wrote the piece 7 years after Katrina.
Right.
So with a lot of distance and a lot of time, I was able to compartmentalize what I wanted to encapsulate.
Yeah, I think that's an important thing to remember, that sometimes these things, you do need that distance. Like, particularly now, I know, well, there are a lot of varying opinions and experiences about writing about the pandemic experience and when and how. Have you been writing during this time, and do you have thoughts about portraying this particular time period?
I've pretty much written only one piece in the whole pandemic time, and it's premiering next week.
Ooh.
It's a piece called Holding Patterns.
Ooh.
And so on one hand, it's very much about an old idea that interested me with electronics, which is the idea of loops that kind of cycle aimlessly and overlap and interweave. But yeah, it is also about the primary emotional sensation of the last 10 months, which has been we're just circling.
I'm curious if you'd like to share anything about sort of any concern or fear you might have had about maybe trying medication or therapy, in thoughts that it might impact your creativity.
Oh, yes. I thought about that a lot from the very beginning. I didn't really try medication or get serious about therapy until I was about 30.
Mhm.
So it took a long time. Part of it is I was moving a lot. I was living in France and Turkey, and it wasn't very easy to. I didn't want to go to therapy in Turkish, for instance. So finally, when I got settled in New York, that's when I was 30. I went to Columbia and started my doctorate and had health care and a US cell phone and all kinds of things that I probably should have had. And that's when I started to get serious about it. And up until that point, I was really skeptical. I had friends who uh, had told me that they went on antidepressants and never felt the same again. And um, yeah, it's something I was very reticent about, but it came to a point where I just felt that I didn't have any other choice.
At a certain point, the illness can kind of be too much of a burden, I've found.
Sure.
Did starting treatment in different iterations, did that impact your creative life?
You know, the problem is once you start treatment or medication, it then becomes very difficult to separate out and say, like, this is because I'm taking this pill that now I'm able to do this, or thanks to my therapy, I'm able to go in this direction. So it's really hard to say, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
Although I know it affected me. I mean, it pushed me in different directions, and sometimes it helped me just to give me the energy and motivation to work.
Yeah.
So I do think it was probably a net gain.
And I know it can take a while to figure out the dosage and which kind. And
Yeah, and the biggest obstacle for me still is getting like some kind of regular treatment when I'm moving between countries, which I still am pretty regularly. So that's a challenge.
you mentioned in your article something which really resonated with me, which is that when you fill out job applications, there's sort of this question of like what to disclose. I've just had the same questions of like, well, is this a disability? Doesn't is
Right.
You know, is it, what is it? How do you explain it? Do you need accommodations? What are they?
Yeah, that is a really big one for me. I approach it almost randomly. Like sometimes I say, okay, this time I'm going to disclose it, and this time I'm not going to check that box. But I think the important question is really what are accommodations for a disability like this? I mean, I have been in professional situations where I'm teaching or interviewing for a job when I start to feel that my depression is going to be an obstacle. Like it's starting to drag me down, and I'm not as communicative as I should be, and I'm not able to focus like I ought to be, and I'm giving the wrong impression. Uh, and I do wonder, like, what if that person across the table, you know, if they knew this detail about me, would it change the impression that I'm giving? But it's hard to say until there's a more generalized awareness of what people who suffer from depression are living with.
Have you
Did that all come through because there was a kid screaming outside?
I heard it. I did hear the kid in the background, but it was kind of a nice ambient sound.
Okay. There's
But yes.
always screaming. It's Italy.
Are there any other aspects of depression that you want to discuss in terms of impacting? We've talked about the creative process, but what about other aspects of work as a composer or as a teacher?
It's just become something that I'm hyper aware of now. The past 5 years, I've been sometimes teaching, sometimes unemployed, and looking for teaching jobs, and sometimes hearing feedback like, Christopher should have looked people in the eyes a little more. Christopher should have been more engaged, and these things that feel like they are manifestations of my depression that are keeping me from making an optimal first impression and from being as engaged as I should be. And that's really a bummer, to feel like this disease could be holding me back. But I think what people need to know and maybe start to become aware of is that there is a trade-off. There are other things that people who suffer from depression are maybe naturally better suited for, better geared towards. I do think that, even though I have sometimes trouble being present and focused, I am a very dedicated and invested teacher. And I think that's in some way related to my illness, and being able to be a little more patient and a little more tolerant, I guess. And I think that's a positive thing that people should value in a mentor, but that isn't the easiest thing to show off.
So you would say it's given you insight or access to great empathy?
Yeah, to some degree. I mean, great empathy might be putting it a little bit too in grandiose terms, but I think that it has made me more empathetic and more willing to look past surface impressions and difficulties in communication.
Do you have any thoughts about what conservatories or different classical music institutions, I mean, we'll talk specifically in our field because that's where we both are, but sort of what can be done in our industry to help?
Yeah, that's a very serious question that I don't really know the answer to. Something that I often think about is that composers like me who have difficulty being the face of the operation, who are not as outgoing as others, probably had an easier time in the past when they had go-betweens, publishers and publicists and people who were there to push your work on your behalf. And I do wonder sometimes, like, are there people who are slipping through the cracks because of this new priority that we place on self-promotion, which, in some ways has been very valuable, but it makes a different type of personality rise to the top, I think.
Yeah.
And Lord knows that if that had always been the case, there are some major composers that we would never have heard of. And so I think a general awareness of that at conservatories, but also on the part of other arts organizations and festivals, orchestras, not to just rely on the self-promotional skills of composers, but to do the extra work of digging under rocks, let's say, for people who can't present themselves as readily. And yeah, I think the important thing at the conservatory level is counseling being available to everyone, and education and awareness. Anxiety has always been an endemic problem in conservatories, right?
Yes, and performance anxiety. When did you start reading about depression, and do you have any recommended favorites?
Yeah, there was one particular book that I read around this time that really dovetailed with writing the essay, and that was Undoing Depression by Richard O'Connor. For whatever reason, it resonated with me a lot more than any other books about the illness that I had read, with one exception, which is William Styron's book, Darkness Visible. And, he's coming at it from the perspective of a novelist. It's a beautiful book, just talking about his own experience with depression, which for him seem to come quite suddenly and late in life. I have this collection of quotes about depression that I have been gathering for years.
Do you have any advice for composers or creatives, musicians working now or not working now? Yeah, just in general advice for anyone struggling with depression. Big question.
It's very hard to give advice, but the thing to do is to keep an eye on yourself and learn to know when you feel that you're getting into more dangerous territory and might need some help.
Yeah. Maybe I'll ask you this. What do you
Okay.
do for fun?
Oh my God, I don't have fun. I like to travel. I like to explore places. I like to walk. Most of my daily dose of entertainment and invigoration is just walking around Palermo, finding new corners, taking pictures, finding crazy street art or dilapidated buildings. Or yesterday I saw uh, a white cat stuck on a rafter about 10 feet up in the air. Yeah, which once I scared it, it jumped back into an apartment and was fine. But those sorts of little accidental daily surprises kind of keep me going.
Yeah. And you're living with you're married or your partner?
I am married,
Yeah.
although right now I'm in Italy and my wife is back in New York. She's building a skyscraper in Manhattan. She's an architect. There are certainly points where our interests intersect, and in particular, our love of travel is what leads us to these new patterns, these new discoveries.
If people want to find you, find your music, where should they go?
Well, I've got a couple of CDs out. One's on New Focus Recordings with Talia Ensemble, Jack Quartet, Lucy de Grey. Another one with the Ictus Ensemble in Belgium. And you can find those links from my website.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time and being so honest and thoughtful with your answers.
It's a pleasure, Julia. I hope we
Yeah.
have a chance to talk again sometime. I'm so grateful to Chris for talking about his experience with depression. I think this is a topic that many are afraid to talk about, and it's so important, as Chris said, that we begin to destigmatize these conversations within our field and within our family and friends. There is no one way to seek support or to take care of yourself. And I think Chris says something very important, which is to just be aware and be careful if you might be approaching an edge where your mental health feels no longer sustainable on your own and you might need help from an external source. So thank you, Chris, and thank you for listening.